Emmett Sloan stood at the altar, his hands trembling as he straightened his best shirt for the third time. The church was empty except for the preacher and 2 witnesses he'd paid to attend. He had never seen his bride's face, never heard her voice, never even asked for her photograph. The letters they'd exchanged spoke of loneliness and hope, but revealed nothing about the woman who would share his name in less than an hour. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the wooden church, each step deliberate and confident. Emmett's breath caught in his throat as the door creaked open. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning light. As his eyes adjusted, he saw her clearly for the first time. Nora Harrow stood nearly a foot taller than him, her shoulders broad and strong, her presence filling the entire doorway like a mountain blocking the sun. His mind raced with questions he'd never thought to ask. Why hadn't she mentioned her size in her letters? Why had he assumed she'd be small and delicate like the other women in town? The preacher cleared his throat impatiently, and Emmett realized he'd been staring with his mouth slightly open. Nora stepped forward, her expression unreadable, carrying herself with a dignity that made Emmett feel smaller than ever. But there was something else in her eyes, something he recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror every morning. Fear. She was just as terrified as he was. The woman who looked like she could lift a grown horse was afraid of what he might say, what he might do, how he might react to the sight of her. In that moment, Emmett understood that they both had secrets, both had reasons for arranging a marriage with a stranger. The preacher opened his book and looked between them expectantly. Nora took another step forward, and Emmett could see the slight tremor in her hands despite her confident posture. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had made her agree to marry a man she'd never met, it was something desperate enough to risk this moment of complete vulnerability. And now they both stood at the edge of a decision that would change everything, with no way to know if either of them was brave enough to take the next step. 3 weeks earlier, Emmett had been sitting in his kitchen, staring at a letter that would change his life forever. The ranch felt too quiet, too empty, with only the sound of wind rattling the wooden shutters to keep him company. He'd written to the marriage agency in desperation, hoping for someone who might understand the isolation that came with owning land in the middle of nowhere. The response came faster than expected, written in careful handwriting that spoke of education and thoughtfulness. Her name was Nora Harrow, and her letters revealed a woman who understood hard work and solitude. She wrote about missing the sound of another person moving through a house, about cooking meals for one and watching the sunset alone. But she never mentioned her appearance, and Emmett never asked. In his mind, he'd created an image of someone petite and gentle, someone who would fit perfectly under his arm and make his small ranch house feel like a home. Now, as Nora stepped closer to the altar, Emmett realized how foolish his assumptions had been. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never needed protection, never needed a man to reach something on a high shelf or carry her across a threshold. Her dress was simple but well-made, clearly tailored to fit her imposing frame. When she reached his side, she had to look down to meet his eyes, and Emmett felt heat rise in his cheeks. The preacher began the ceremony, his voice echoing in the empty church. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." But Emmett could barely focus on the words. He kept stealing glances at Nora, trying to reconcile the woman beside him with the voice he'd imagined while reading her letters. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression giving nothing away. When the preacher asked if there were any objections, the silence stretched longer than it should have. Emmett felt Nora tense beside him, and he wondered if she was having the same doubts he was. The preacher continued, but Emmett caught something in Nora's eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. It wasn't just fear or uncertainty. It was something deeper, something that made him think her letters hadn't told him everything about why she'd agreed to marry a stranger. As they reached the part where they would exchange vows, Nora turned to face him fully for the first time. Her voice was softer than he'd expected, barely above a whisper. "I need you to know something before we continue." The preacher paused, and Emmett felt his heart stop. Whatever she was about to tell him would either save this marriage or destroy it before it even began. Nora's words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. The preacher shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to finish the ceremony and collect his fee. Emmett waited, his throat dry, knowing that whatever she said next would change everything. Her hands, which had seemed so steady moments before, now trembled slightly as she looked down at him. "I've never been married before," she began, her voice barely audible. "But I've been engaged twice." The admission hit Emmett like a physical blow. 2 men had wanted to marry this woman, and something had gone wrong both times. His mind raced with possibilities. None of them good. Had she left them at the altar? Had they left her? The way she said it, with such careful precision, told him there was more to the story. Emmett found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. What happened to them? The question seemed to surprise her, as if she'd expected him to simply walk away without asking for details. She glanced toward the church door, and for a moment he thought she might bolt. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and met his eyes directly. The first one took one look at me and said he'd changed his mind about wanting a wife. Her voice carried years of hurt beneath the matter-of-fact tone. The second one lasted through the engagement party before deciding I wasn't what he'd imagined. Emmett could see the pain she tried to hide, the careful way she held herself as if preparing for him to deliver the same rejection. The church felt smaller now, the silence pressing down on them. The preacher cleared his throat again, but neither Emmett nor Nora moved. Emmett studied her face, seeing past the size and strength to something vulnerable underneath. She'd traveled hundreds of miles to marry a stranger because 2 other men had humiliated her. She'd come here expecting the same thing to happen again, yet she'd come anyway. "Why didn't you tell me in your letters?" Emmett asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Nora's laugh was bitter, without any humor. "Would you have agreed to marry me if I'd described myself honestly? If I'd told you I stand 6 feet tall and can lift a grown man off his feet?" Her directness surprised him. Most women he knew spoke in careful circles around difficult truths. Emmett looked at the preacher, then back at Nora. The smart thing would be to call off the ceremony, to admit this wasn't what either of them had planned. But something in her eyes stopped him from speaking the words that would send her away. She wasn't just asking if he could accept her size. She was asking if he could see her as something more than a mistake, more than a woman too big for any man to want. And suddenly, Emmett realized he had his own confession to make. Emmett took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his own secret pressing against his chest. "I didn't ask for your photograph because I was afraid you'd ask for mine." The confession tumbled out before he could stop it. Nora's eyebrows drew together in confusion, and he forced himself to continue. "I'm not exactly what most women consider marriage material." He gestured toward himself with a self-deprecating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm barely 5 feet 6 inches tall. I stutter when I'm nervous. And I've never kissed a woman in my life." The admission made his face burn with embarrassment, but he couldn't stop now. "Every woman in town looks right through me like I'm not even there. The ones who do notice me treat me like a child who wandered away from his mother." Nora's expression softened, and something shifted in the space between them. "You were afraid I'd reject you," she said, understanding dawning in her voice. It wasn't a question. Emmett nodded, unable to trust his voice. They stood there, 2 people who'd been rejected for being different, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. The preacher, clearly uncomfortable with the extended conversation, spoke up. "Perhaps we should postpone this ceremony until you've both had time to consider." But Nora shook her head firmly. "No, we've both traveled too far to turn back now." She looked at Emmett with new interest, as if seeing him for the first time. "You still want to go through with this?" Emmett studied her face, seeing strength and kindness where he'd initially only noticed size. "Do you?" The question hung between them, more honest than anything either had written in their careful letters. Nora nodded slowly, and something like relief flickered across her features. "Then let's do this properly," she said, reaching for his hands. Her fingers were calloused from work, warm and steady despite her earlier nervousness. Emmett felt small in her grasp, but not diminished. For the first time in his life, a woman was choosing him, knowing exactly who he was. The preacher resumed the ceremony with visible relief, but Emmett barely heard the familiar words. He was too focused on Nora's face, on the way she looked at him without pity or condescension. When they reached the part about exchanging rings, Emmett realized with growing panic that he'd forgotten something crucial. He'd been so focused on his fears about meeting his bride that he'd never bought wedding rings. His face went pale as he patted his empty pockets, and Nora noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she whispered, concern replacing the cautious hope in her eyes. The preacher paused mid-sentence, waiting, and Emmett realized this moment could destroy everything they'd just built between them. Emmett's face burned with shame as he looked at Nora's expectant expression. "I forgot to buy rings," he whispered, the words barely audible. He'd spent weeks worrying about every detail of the ceremony except the most important part. The preacher sighed heavily, clearly wanting to finish what had already become the longest wedding he'd ever performed. But instead of anger or disappointment, Nora did something unexpected. She laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but something warm and genuine that filled the empty church. "You know what?" she said, reaching into her bag. "I brought something just in case." She pulled out a simple gold band that had clearly been worn before. It was my grandmother's wedding ring. She always said it would bring luck to whoever wore it next. Emmett stared at the ring, then at Nora. "You were planning for this to go wrong." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. She nodded without shame. "I've learned to expect disappointment, but I also learned to come prepared." She held the ring up to the light streaming through the church windows. "This ring survived 43 years of marriage. If it can handle my grandmother and grandfather, it can handle us." The gesture touched something deep in Emmett's chest. She'd come to their wedding carrying a backup plan for his failure, but she'd still come. "What about you?" he asked. "I don't have anything for you." Nora glanced at her own bare finger, then at his face. "I haven't worn jewelry in years. Most rings don't fit my fingers anyway." Emmett looked at her hands, really looked at them for the first time. They were strong and capable, but also elegant in their own way. "That's not right," he said quietly. "Every bride should have a ring." The preacher cleared his throat pointedly, but Emmett ignored him. Without thinking, he began working his father's signet ring off his pinky finger. It was too small for most men's hands, but it had been perfect for his slight frame. "This was my father's," he said, holding it out to her. "It's not much, but it's the only thing of value I own besides the ranch." The ring was simple silver with a small engraved design, worn smooth by decades of wear. Nora looked at it as if he'd offered her a precious jewel. "I can't take your father's ring," she protested, but Emmett was already reaching for her hand. The ring slid onto her finger perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They both stared at it in surprise. "Looks like it belongs there," Emmett said softly. The preacher, sensing his chance, quickly resumed the ceremony. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The words echoed in the empty church, making their marriage official. But when the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," both Emmett and Nora froze. Neither had considered this moment. Emmett would have to stand on his toes to reach her lips, and Nora would have to bend down considerably. The awkwardness of their size difference had never been more apparent. The preacher waited expectantly, and Emmett felt his confidence crumble. But then Nora surprised him once again. Without hesitation, Nora dropped to one knee, bringing herself to Emmett's eye level. The gesture was so unexpected and graceful that it took his breath away. She wasn't making him feel small or highlighting their differences. Instead, she was meeting him where he was, literally and figuratively. "Better?" she asked softly, her eyes level with his for the first time. Emmett nodded, unable to speak. When he leaned forward to kiss her, it felt natural, rather than awkward. Her lips were soft and warm, and the kiss was brief, but genuine. When they parted, Nora remained kneeling for a moment longer, studying his face with something that might have been wonder. The preacher closed his book with obvious relief and handed Emmett the marriage certificate. "Congratulations," he said curtly, already gathering his things. The two witnesses approached to sign the document, their expressions curious but polite. Within minutes, the church was empty except for the newly married couple. Emmett and Nora stood in the sudden silence, both seeming to realize they were now alone together for the first time. The weight of what they'd just done settled between them like a heavy blanket. They were married, but they were still strangers. Emmett cleared his throat nervously. "I suppose we should head to the ranch," he said, his stutter returning now that the ceremony was over. Nora nodded, but she seemed hesitant. "Emmett, there's something else I need to tell you before we go to your home." Her serious tone made his stomach drop. What else could there be? He'd already learned she'd been rejected twice, that she was much larger than he'd imagined, and that she came prepared for disappointment. What other secrets was she carrying? "The reason I answered your advertisement," she began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "It wasn't just because I was lonely." She walked to the church window and stared out at the dusty street. "I'm running from something. Someone, actually." The admission hung in the air like a threat. Emmett felt cold, despite the warm afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "What kind of someone?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Nora's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and he could see tension in every line of her body. "My stepfather," she said finally. "He's been trying to force me into a marriage with his business partner for 2 years. When I refused, he threatened to have me declared mentally unfit and take control of the small inheritance my mother left me. Her voice grew harder with each word. I had to disappear before he could follow through on his threats. Emmett stared at her, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. She hadn't just been looking for a husband. She'd been looking for protection, for a way to escape a man who wanted to control her life, and now that man might come looking for her. The church felt smaller now, as if Nora's revelation had changed the very air inside. Emmett looked at his new wife and saw her differently again, not just a woman who'd been rejected for her size, but someone running from real danger. "How much time do we have?" he asked, surprising himself with how calm his voice sounded. Nora turned from the window, relief flickering across her face at his practical response. "I don't know. I covered my tracks as well as I could, but Jeremiah Blackwood has resources and connections. If he's determined to find me, he will." The name meant nothing to Emmett, but the way she said it made his skin crawl. "What does he want with your inheritance?" Emmett asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Nora's laugh was bitter. "It's not just the money, though, that's part of it. My mother owned a piece of land that borders his property. He's been trying to buy it for years, but she always refused. When she died, it came to me." She touched the silver ring on her finger absently. "He thought he could control me the way he controlled her." Emmett felt anger building in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. He'd never been the type to fight other men's battles, but the thought of someone threatening Nora made him want to do violence. "So you married me to keep him from taking what's yours." It should have hurt to realize she hadn't chosen him for himself, but instead, he felt oddly proud that she'd trusted him enough to see him as protection. "Partly," Nora admitted. Then her voice softened, "but not entirely. Your letters, Emmett, they were kind. You wrote about wanting someone to share quiet evenings with, about having someone to talk to while you worked. You didn't write about needing a woman to cook and clean and bear children. You wrote about loneliness." She stepped closer to him. "I've been lonely too." The honesty in her voice made Emmett's throat tight. "What happens when he finds us?" Because he would find them. Emmett was certain of that now. Men like Jeremiah Blackwood didn't give up easily, especially when land and money were involved. Nora's jaw set with determination. "He can't force me to leave my legal husband. That's why I needed the marriage to be real. Documented." She looked at Emmett with new intensity. "But I need you to understand what you're getting into. Jeremiah isn't just my stepfather. He's a man who's used to getting what he wants, and he doesn't care who gets hurt in the process." Before Emmett could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the church windows. Multiple riders moving fast and with purpose. Nora went rigid, her face draining of color. "It's too soon," she whispered. "He couldn't have found me this quickly." Emmett moved to the window and peered out carefully. 3 men on horseback were approaching the church, their dust cloud visible from a mile away. The lead rider sat tall in his saddle with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Even from a distance, Emmett could see the man's expensive clothes and the way the other riders deferred to him. "Is that him?" Emmett asked, though the sick expression on Nora's face had already given him his answer. She nodded, backing away from the window as if Jeremiah Blackwood could see her through the glass. "How did he find us so fast?" she whispered, more to herself than to Emmett. The riders were close now, close enough that Emmett could hear their voices carrying on the wind. They would reach the church in minutes. Emmett looked at his wife of less than an hour and made a decision that would define the rest of their marriage. Emmett straightened his shoulders and turned away from the window. "Hide behind the altar," he told Nora quietly. "Let me talk to them first." But Nora shook her head, her fear transforming into something harder. "No, running and hiding is what got me into this mess. If Jeremiah wants a confrontation, he'll get one." The church door burst open with enough force to rattle the hinges. Jeremiah Blackwood filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his expensive coat dusty from hard riding. He was a man in his 50s with silver hair and cold eyes that seemed to catalog everything in the room instantly. 2 younger men flanked him, clearly hired muscle rather than family. "Nora," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to obedience. "You've led us quite a chase." His gaze swept over Emmett dismissively, before returning to Nora. "I hope you've had your little adventure, because it's time to come home and face your responsibilities." Nora stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Emmett. "I am home, Jeremiah. This is my husband, Emmett Sloan. We were just married." She held up her hand, showing the silver ring that caught the afternoon light. Jeremiah's laugh was sharp and ugly. Married? To this boy? He looked at Emmett with open contempt. You think a piece of paper and a rushed ceremony will protect you from your legal obligations? I have documents proving you're mentally unstable, Nora. This marriage won't stand up in any court. Emmett felt his face burn with humiliation, but he forced himself to speak. The marriage is legal and binding. Nora is my wife now and her business is my business. His voice only shook slightly, and he was proud of that small victory. One of Jeremiah's men snickered at Emmett's declaration, but Jeremiah held up a hand for silence. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Boy, Nora owns land that rightfully belongs to me. She's cost me months of negotiations and thousands of dollars with her childish rebellion. The land belonged to my mother, Nora said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She left it to me, not to you. You have no legal claim to it. Jeremiah's expression darkened. Legal claims can be adjusted, especially when dealing with the property of someone who's been declared incompetent. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. I have papers here stating that Nora Harrow is mentally unfit to manage her own affairs, signed by a doctor and witnessed by a judge. Emmett stared at the document, understanding the trap Nora had been running from. With those papers, Jeremiah could control everything she owned, including forcing her into any marriage he chose. But there was something Jeremiah hadn't considered. Those papers are for Nora Harrow, Emmett said quietly. But my wife's name is Nora Sloan now. Your documents are worthless. The silence that followed was electric with tension, and Emmett realized he'd just declared war on a man who looked like he enjoyed destroying people. Jeremiah's face flushed red with rage, and for a moment Emmett thought the man might strike him. Instead, Jeremiah stepped closer, using his height and bulk to intimidate. You think you're clever, don't you, boy? Name changes don't matter when I can have this marriage annulled for fraud. Nora didn't tell you about her mental condition, did she? But Emmett had found his courage now, and he wasn't backing down. There's nothing wrong with Nora's mind. She's the strongest, most capable person I've ever met. He looked directly into Jeremiah's cold eyes. But I'm starting to wonder about yours. What kind of man chases his stepdaughter across 3 states just to steal her inheritance? The insult hit its mark. Jeremiah's hand moved toward his coat, and Emmett tensed, wondering if the man was armed. But Nora stepped between them, her full height making her an imposing barrier. Enough, she said, her voice carrying a new authority. Jeremiah, you've had your say. Now leave my husband and me alone. This isn't over, Jeremiah snarled, but Emmett could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. The documents he'd counted on were useless now, and a public confrontation in a church wasn't the kind of pressure he'd planned to apply. I'll be back with proper legal authorities. You do that, Nora said calmly. But when you do, make sure you bring documentation that my marriage isn't legal. Because if you can't prove fraud or coercion, then everything I own now belongs to my husband as well, including the right to make decisions about my mother's land. Emmett watched Jeremiah's face as the implications sank in. By marrying Nora, Emmett hadn't just given her protection. He'd also become a legal obstacle to Jeremiah's plans. The older man couldn't simply bully or